Hello, this is Matt Ballant, and this is a recording of a session I gave at the Elevate 2019 conference entitled After Action Report, Migrating PowerBuilder Applications. This information is provided, is basically my opinion. This is not any official word or anything like that from Appian. Again, my name is Matt Ballant. I'm a PowerBuilder developer. I've been working in PowerBuilder for probably 25 years. Currently, I'm employed by LabCorp, which is a large medical sample testing organization, one of the largest in the world. Some of my background, obviously, I know PowerBuilder. I've done a fair amount of work in C#. Most of my PowerBuilder work has been in conjunction with SQL Server, although I've worked in Oracle, Sybase, basically all the large relational database systems around. So recently, this project that I'll be discussing involves the migration of a suite of PowerBuilder applications from Sybase ASE onto Microsoft SQL Server. So, in a nutshell, this migration project was to involve the move from Sybase ASE database to SQL Server. The suite of applications were all designed and originally created in the middle 1990s and have been in continuous use by LabCorp since then. So the goal was to reduce some technical debt, reduce licensing for the Sybase system, because most, if not all, of the employees that had knowledge in that system had retired. There's actually two suites of PowerBuilder applications. One referred to as Paternity, dealt mainly with the scheduling and processing of DNA tests, primarily relating to paternity, which was used in legal cases as well as immigration cases. And the other suite dealt with a bone marrow system, which was involved with the National Bone Marrow Registry program. Like I said, we were trying to save licensing fees, reduce technology debt, take advantage of newer technology. Microsoft Stack was the corporate direction. And they also planned on doing any future work and rework of the existing applications in .NET. So some of the expectations when I was brought on board, as they were communicated to me, it was a somewhat open timeline, but generally expected to take between 6 and 12 months. There wasn't really foreseen many issues. One of the prevailing ideas being that Sybase and SQL Server had at one time, and this is back going to the 1990s, shared a common code base. There wasn't a large staff devoted to this project initially, just two of us. The initial plan was to migrate one system and then to use lessons learned to migrate the second system. Now, in the planning phase, there had been, I'd say, approximately 2 years before the beginning of the project. And the project began in the spring of 2017. And there had been an analysis done, very superficial analysis on some of the issues involved in the project. So there was some background analysis done. But this slide, I want to introduce something that I've used on previous jobs and previous projects called function point analysis. Now, if you look online in function point analysis, you'll find a very detailed and very cerebral definition of this in the process, and that's really different than what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about involves analyzing the IT project that you're doing and grouping like things with like things. And in the PowerBuilder world, you can do that by saying basically all of your objects. You can group your objects into windows, data windows, maybe some ancillary NVOs, that sort of thing. But those are nice little groupings that you can create, and you can count the numbers of those things involved in your applications. Same goes with database world. You can say tables are one thing, stored procedures, functions, views, those sorts of things. They're easily grouped. So once you have these groupings, you need to kind of decide based on your previous experience with the team that you're working with and assign a certain amount of time for each of these items. And you can also take into account, when you're figuring out this amount of time, other tasks that might come up with this team. Are they specifically and only tasked with this upgrade, or are they also expected to do support of the existing system during this time? Certainly the experience level of the team comes into play, both in the amount of time per object, but also in an overall amount of time, say, per week that they could allocate themselves to this project. Because if 10% of their time is allocated to existing application support, then obviously you need to take that into account in your planning. So what I'm going to do is I have a spreadsheet, and I can show this that illustrates this very easily. Just got to be able to bring it up here. Okay. So this is a simple little spreadsheet here that I made to illustrate this concept here. So I have my function points, and for example, some of these are reality, some of these are based on guesses, but because I didn't have the numbers right in front of me specific to this project at the time that I created this. But the tables, the triggers, the procedures, that's the database stuff is pretty accurate. So over 500 tables, a much lesser number of triggers, but the big gorilla here is the 700 stored procedures. And when we get to this bottom part, windows, data window objects, NVOs, API type stuff, that's all from PowerBuilder, and those are a little less accurate in their numbers. But now if you look at the hours column, this is very generous in an hour per item setting. So an hour here, 1.5 hours for each of the triggers, etc. And then obviously I have a total column. So you can see here in the total of this, just based on this very high level analysis, you're talking over 6,000 hours of work. And so with 2 people or even 3 people, you'd be very hard pressed to get this type of project done within a 12-month time frame, and certainly would not get it done if they're expected to also support production or have other duties that they have to perform within their job. So I just wanted to bring this up. This is a very simple yet effective way of illustrating the amount of time and effort it takes to do even a quote-unquote relatively simple database upgrade. So some of the tools that we used, I'll list these out later. But obviously with SQL Server, you're talking about SQL Server, Management Studio, PowerBuilder, of course. There was a variety of other tools that were used, open source and third-party tools that allowed for large manipulation of text files and things like that, because from the database we were dealing almost exclusively with text files of the objects. So that lent itself very well to certain mass search and replace type functionality. Now, your planning also needs to take into account your particular organizational structure and are other departmental resources needed. And what I mean by that is, if you have a team of, say, database or DBA type folks, and they're the ones charged with actually setting up and maintaining security on database servers, they're going to need to allocate resources to your project as well. And that can be highly problematic, again, based on the amount of communication and the amount of executive support you have with the project. Now this seems like a very simple concept here, but again, simple doesn't mean that it's obvious to a lot of people. And what I mean by a task list is you have to have some sort of list, some sort of spreadsheet, some sort of document that details at the beginning of the project, as you understand it, what needs to be done, and broken down as granular as you can. Something else that you need to do is, without doubt, you're going to have some aha moments where you're going to discover some process that maybe no one has thought about, or it's some batch job that's run, triggered by some mainframe somewhere that runs once a month or something of that nature, and maybe your team is not directly involved in it, but it touches the database that you are. So these kinds of things are going to come up, and one of the recommendations I would make is whenever something like this happens, you need to flag it. And it doesn't necessarily mean that, okay, we're going to figure out exactly how we're going to do this at the time you discover it, but you do need to flag things and put them down for future consideration. So when you're going into, say, moving out of development mode into QA, and then certainly from QA into production, that these tasks are addressed by someone at some certain time frame as well. This is these dependencies can often get lost if you're not someone who is lived and breathed this application for many, many years. And along the same lines, with your task lists, you need to decide, okay, how long is this going to take? Let's say one of your tasks is going to be, well, we need to modify every single one of our data window objects because we need to account for different join syntax, for example. Now, if you're talking about a 25-year-old application like I am, it's going to have hundreds and hundreds of data window objects. And that is a task best divided up amongst many people. I mean, certainly one person could handle it, but it's going to take them a significant amount of time, weeks and weeks and weeks. And if there's some dependency on that, then obviously those dependent things cannot begin until the previous task is complete. So getting back to SQL, I'm just going to briefly touch on some of the issues that we discovered and ran into that significantly extended and impacted this project. And in regards to SQL, again, this application was created back in the middle 90s, and now we're here at almost 2020. And one of the things that many people don't really realize is SQL has evolved over that time. And if you want to follow ANSI standards, the ANSI standards have evolved quite a bit as well. And so things which might have been done back in the 90s and were acceptable are really no longer necessarily acceptable, depending upon obviously what they are, but the standards have changed. And if they've changed to the opposite of what your application was doing, then you really need to address that issue and allocate time and resources to it. Prime example is ANSI null settings. The old system allowed for null comparisons, where a null equals a null. Well, in Microsoft SQL Server, you can do that, but it's highly, highly recommended that you don't. And there's many things that do not work if you have ANSI nulls off. So that's just a prime example of one ANSI setting that had to be changed, and code had to change to account for that. Obviously, between databases, there's data types. Again, you're talking 25 years ago. The data types, especially when you're talking about large binary objects and things of that nature, and text, are different today. And SQL Server has different data types than back then. And some of the older data types are being deprecated. So again, you need to decide, is this something that we can do now, or can we put it off, but certainly don't ignore it. Error checking. The original error checking logic in stored procedures and triggers was very problematic. And again, anyone who's done any significant development work in SQL knows that error checking has always been pretty horrible in any SQL database, SQL Server being no exception. However, the newer style of error checking involves the use of try-catch blocks, and it's much more robust, and it's much easier to deal with than in the past, where after every single statement you had to capture whether or not at error was greater than 0. And so part of this would also mean there's a lot of code that you have to strip out, because if you move to a try-catch logic, all of the existing error stuff basically is obsolete and needs to be removed. Process identification. What I mean by this is we have some triggers that are not supposed to fire if they are called from specific stored procedures. And this is very problematic in SQL because the variable at proc ID only identifies the existing object. So if a trigger is being triggered by a calling stored procedure, there's no way of you knowing what stored procedure called it. So that turned out to be a headache as well that we had to overcome. We did that via the use of writing to table and with the process ID and checking within the cursor to see if there was anything in the table for the current process ID, and if so, if it was a particular type that we had to skip, we skipped it. Just the use of cursors itself, again, cursor use is generally frowned upon in the SQL Server world, but it exists, and there are correct ways to do it, and it's different than from a Sybase database. So that's something else that needs to be looked at, and not necessarily fixed per se, but you need to know that there's different ways of declaring and executing cursors in SQL Server. We had a fair amount of issues with the groupings. In Sybase, they allowed groupings where even though you had a list of columns that you were returning, you didn't necessarily have to have them in the grouping or any aggregate functions. And so we had to come up with different ways of achieving the grouping values throughout the application because of the differences, and SQL Server would simply not allow some of the syntax that had been used in Sybase. Identity values can also be an issue, those being whether or not you use record IDs versus smart keys and those kinds of things within the database. These are just some of the things that we ran into. There were others, but these seem to be some of the larger ones that we had to take into account. In PowerBuilder, obviously, you're going to change database drivers if you're going to a new database. You also have potential impact on how you're handling transactions, again, based on how you're changing your database drivers. Again, error checking, this should be, everyone should know this, but you want to always check error whenever you're checking for errors, whenever you do any sort of SQL, embedded SQL within PowerBuilder. And I would also recommend that you check for errors anytime you do set trans object and connect with a data window or data store, just to ensure that you have a valid connection. Pathing became an issue with us with the newer versions of Windows and some of the security paradigms that are in existence now. There's things you simply cannot do anymore in applications. One of them that we ran into was writing files to the root of C of the workstation. That's not allowed, and I mean that has gone out of favor many years ago, but we had a fair amount of that we had to code for, and to make sure that any files being saved or that sort of thing were not stored on the root of the C drive. Again, cursor use within PowerBuilder. There's differing syntax can be brought into play on this. It's again something that we ran into, and we had to find different ways around any issues that we had. I mean, basically, this project too, the mandate was not to really fix anything, quote unquote. And what I mean by that is it was understood that this application was not up to current standards by any means. However, the focus of the project was moving on to a new database. And once we got there, then we could, at some future time, address some of the structural and fundamental issues with the application that were causing poor performance and were problematic. So even though we were tasked with not changing a whole lot. There were times that we had to, but there was also times where we wanted to, but we did not because it fell out of the mandate of the project. And just some miscellaneous topics I wanted to bring up during this presentation. The first of them is what I call entropy code. Quite often, you look at code from some bygone era, and again, this being 25 years ago, and you got to remember that back in those days, nobody was a PowerBuilder expert. PowerBuilder hadn't been out long enough for there to be really any true experts. So people were coming from whatever background they came from, whether it was mainframe programming, whether it was basic programming, maybe it was some C++ or Windows VB3, those kinds of interactions. And so just because something works doesn't mean it's the proper way to do it. The 600 stored procedure dilemma really was more like 700 stored procedures. But what I mean by this is when we extracted the database objects out of the Sybase database, we did it as one text file. So our stored procedure text file was over 5 megabytes, several 100,000 lines, containing all of the stored procedures. And I would really recommend you not doing it that way. You really need to produce a file for each of your objects, because that way it becomes a much easier task to break down. You can assign certain groupings to certain people to go through, and it's not just one huge honking file that when you're working it, you just never seem to make any progress. And it can be very detrimental to your morale when you're having to slog through a 5 megabyte text file. Mass data window object updates. What I mean here is there are tools which allow you to extract SQL out of data windows. You are still going to have to touch each of them, however, and there really isn't any way around it. I mean, if you're changing your join syntax, because again, back in the old days, a join was often designated with an asterisk equals or an equals asterisk, and that kind of syntax is long gone out of the ANSI standard and replaced by left join and right join and inner outer joins, those sorts of things. So if you have code that has the old way of doing things, I mean, as text files, it's easy to identify them. You can use applications which will scan through text files and can report to you which files have matched your string that you're looking for. So that at least narrow it down to the ones that you need to touch. But you are basically going to have to touch every single data window. And what I mean by digging the ditch is, you know, regardless of what it is you're doing, you just got to get it done. You got to, and this is the tough part, you have to just put your shoulder to it and just keep pushing and keep pushing and keep pushing. It sometimes seems like you're never going to see that light at the end of the tunnel, and hopefully that light you see is not a train coming towards you. But this can be very, very difficult to just get the thing done. And finally, voices from beyond. Like I indicated earlier, you're always going to come across something that someone had not thought about. Again, an application that's been around for so long and standards and things like that have changed. You're bound to run into something. And hopefully you can run into these things earlier rather than later. But it's going to happen. And the best you can do is, certainly document what it is. If it's not something that immediately requires attention, fine, just move on. But make sure you document what it is uh, so you can later address it. I wanted to share some of the tools that I used. I'm not really going to do much of a demo per se, but these are just some of the tools. I don't have links to any of these because really what you want to do is just go on Google and search for them. Notepad++ is an outstanding text editor, and it has many plugins which will allow you to just do all kinds of things, from file comparison to what I really like using it for is formatting SQL. And the next item on the list is this Poor Man SQL Formatter. And it comes as a plugin for Notepad++, but it can also be loaded and be available in SQL Server Management Studio. So you can use it in both places and establish how you want to have your SQL formatted, and it can be uniform between those two tools. Windows grep, that is a very old application, but what it does is it allows you to search through text files for strings. So again, if you have a source control folder where you have all your data window objects, you can use a tool like this and looking for things like the old join syntax with the asterisk equals or the equals asterisk, and that will help you. I'm sure there are other tools that can do the same thing. This is just one that I chose to use. TXT collector, that's a small utility, and basically what it does is it takes individual files and concatenates them all together. So what I was using it for is once I had finished all of my database objects, for example, all of my table definitions, and I wanted to create one script to create all my tables, I could use this text collector tool pointed at the folder where all of the SQL files were that created tables, and this program would create one large file that contained all of the SQL in it. You also have the ability to put a separator between the files, and that worked out well because I just put in a go command, so each table creation statement was separated by a go. Roland Smith, TopWiz Programming, he has a tool called PB Search, and as I said at the conference, every PowerBuilder developer in the world today should buy a copy of this from Roland. As Roland has done a huge amount for the PowerBuilder community, and if you've never been to his website, just Google TopWiz Programming, and he has all sorts of free tools and free code and sample applications of how to do things, and he's very responsive if you have a question or need assistance, and I really would highly recommend everybody buying a copy of PB Search. Something else that I came up with, I found on the internet, and I thought I'd share it with everybody, is I had the need to take the name of a file and insert it into the actual text within the file. And so I did some Google searching for something there, and I found this little script which is at the bottom. Let's see if I can make it a little bigger. So hopefully you can see that. Let's get this out of the way. Make it even bigger. Whoops. I'm sorry. Where did it go? Oh, I went to the next slide. Okay, here we go. So if you want to take a screenshot of that or pull that out of there, this helped me in create. I needed this when I was creating scripts for triggers, because we had to rename our triggers from what they had been, and this allowed me to put the name of each of the triggers from the file name into the actual text, so it was easier to identify. Okay. This is a recording. There's no Q&A. Just some more information about the Appian community. Obviously, if you're seeing this, you probably know about all of this already. But thank you for watching.